G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Unparliamentary, our fortnightly series where we catch up on what's happening in federal politics. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a few weeks since our last one, so we're delighted to have a new guest today. We're joined by Clare Armstrong, the National Political Editor of the Daily Telegraph, Courier Mail, Adelaide Advertiser, and the Herald Sun. Thanks so much for joining us, Clare.
Thanks for having me, and apologies for the background. I'm in the most soundproof environment I could find, which is a car.
In regional Australia, we appreciate you finding a spot of reception to join us today. I did want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And just a quick bit of housekeeping before we keep going. So if you are new to Zoom, although that's hard to believe at this point, you can type comments in the chat. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic or we'll boot you out. You can put questions for Clare and for myself in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those in the second half of the webinar. And lastly, a reminder that this is being recorded and it will go up on our YouTube channel within about 24 hours. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. As per usual, it's been a big couple of weeks in politics. That always seems to be the case. Lots going on. Domestically, we've obviously had the stage 3 tax cuts come into being. We've seen Senator Fatima Payman resign from the Labor Party to sit on the crossbench. There's allegations of the influential CFMEU being infiltrated by criminal elements following some serious investigative reporting from the 9 papers. Lots of people are starting to turn their attention to the next federal election. But the thing that's really dominating the headlines at the moment, Clare, is the US presidential election and its upcoming election. We've obviously seen President Joe Biden withdraw from being the Democratic nominee, and he's anointed his Vice President Kamala Harris to be the presumptive Democratic nominee. But this has really thrown a huge spanner in the works in the United States election, hasn't it?
It's definitely made it a far more interesting next 3 or 4 months to watch how this contest plays out. I think all of the polls in America, at least, were showing that the public was not interested in a rematch, that they didn't necessarily want the 45th or the 46th president of the United States to become the 47th. And that I think that had led to quite a bit of polarization in one camp, but also just very with a lot of the people were withdrawing from that political process and the debate altogether, not really showing up for primaries. And what's really happened, I think, that's quite interesting at a grassroots level is we've instantly seen a real shift, and it's like, early days, but it feels as though we're going to see quite a return to a contest of ideas rather than a contest between 2 individuals and who's going to make it or who's going to, in terms of who can make it through a term or who's not going to, destroy the country. So, so many kind of things to talk about from the fallout of that. But the big picture, I think, is it has dialed everyone back into the issues a little bit more than just the individual, contest of two presidents.
Yeah, I agree. And we've certainly seen, it did feel like the Democrats were really kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think one of the things that has definitely kept the pressure on President Biden to withdraw is those down ballot races where people were seeing that, as you said, the kind of apathy, which is so critical in a US election where you're really relying on voter turnout. They don't have compulsory voting, so it really does rely on your base being energized to get out and vote. And we've certainly seen that that's been a problem for the Democrats in particular. Trump's base always seems to be pretty energized, at least a certain section of it. But I do think that's really interesting what you've said there, Clare, about that shift in, I guess, momentum and a re-energizing of people like dialing back into politics. I think this is effectively a bit of a circuit breaker for the Democrats. Would you say that's the impact that it's going to have?
I definitely think it's a step change, and it will take a little bit of time to really understand whether that's a step change that's really like for the benefit and leveled them up. There's so many complicating factors here. You know, if you go back historically, Kamala Harris, who obviously now is most likely the presumptive kind of nominee, was quite a favorite in 2019 leading into the 2020 primary contest. There was a lot of buzz around her, and a lot of kind of what fell apart for her at that time, she didn't even make it to the first round of voting. She dropped out before that. And that was because there was a lot of problems with the way she was sort of talking. She wasn't able to explain her policies and her positions very well when put on the spot. There was a lot of drama with her team. She had quite a high kind of staff turnover. So there were sort of real structural problems with her initial bid for that 2020 presidential nomination. And it remains to be seen if within a few weeks we're not looking at, you know, a Kamala Harris of a similar era where there has been issues with those kinds of structural things. Obviously, when you've got the entire Democratic Party machine wrapping around you as the nominee versus just being a primary candidate, it's quite different. But it's a step change for the Democrats. But if she's not able to capitalize on that momentum and show that she's not, you know, the politician that she was 5 years ago, it may be in a similar situation where you've got Trump keeping a lid on some of his more outrageous tendencies, at least in terms of those one-on-one matchups in debates. And you've got Kamala maybe struggling, not in the way that Joe Biden was obviously very visibly struggling in their first debate, but it may not necessarily translate into sort of longer-term momentum. Financially, it obviously has. We've seen overnight about $50 million Australian worth of donations flowing into the Democratic camp, into Harris's campaign, which is, I think, the single biggest day of donations since 2020. So,
yeah, certainly a good indication that that's re-energized the Democratic base for her. And I really think it's a good point that you raised about, like, does this really turn the election campaign back to issues and a bit more substance? And on that, I guess, you know, she's been Kamala Harris has been really the face of the Biden administration's campaigning around, in particular, reproductive rights, which is also a really motivating factor for Democratic voters to turn out. And I think one of the strongest contrasts between the Democrats and the Republican ticket, J.D. Vance is very strongly pro-life, anti-abortion, very critical of, you know, he's been very vocal and outspoken against, I guess, a range of women's rights over there. I think potentially this draws quite, if she does remain at the top of the ticket and becomes the Democratic nominee, quite a stark contrast between the two camps. And she's been a very effective advocate. And we know it's been very critical for Democrats in a lot of state-based elections and races for turning out the vote quite effectively for them. Do you have any thoughts on that and any other issues that you think this will, I guess, return the focus on rather than, as you said, that contest of personalities?
So many thoughts on the reproductive rights and the way that Kamala Harris has campaigned very solidly on this issue. I mean, I don't want to appear reductive by saying this, but I mean, it's somewhat self-evident that having that conversation through a female leader who brings a female perspective is obviously going to be much more impactful, have potential to be really reaching a large demographic in a way that, you know, Biden was also very strong on since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And he also said a lot of the same things, but, you know, in a campaign where you're building a narrative and you're trying to get the public engaged, yeah, she is a far more compelling messenger for that particular issue. And the Republicans know that it's hurting them. And that's why we've seen Trump, who, you know, paved the way for the overturning of that historic court decision, has really stepped back now and said it's a state issue. And even J.D. Vance, as you mentioned, is very strong anti-abortion, pro-life. He, in very recent days, since basically getting the nod to be the VP candidate for the Republicans, has shifted his language as well to saying, well, you know, it's now up to the states. I think where Kamala has been quite successful and will continue to be in the campaign and the marketing and the social media around her is, oh, great, you say it's up to the states. Well, the second that court decision came through, there were many states that had triggered laws that were automatically triggered and came into place. You've got states that are continually, Republican-controlled states that are continually trying to ramp up and push through more and more restrictions around reproductive health and reproductive rights. So if Trump is saying, it's up to the governor of Alabama, well, that's not really any better than him just maintaining the position that he had before in terms of access and equality around this health issue. So I think on that one in particular, yes, it was already a very strong point of difference. All of the polling was showing it motivates people to turn out. And Kamala being now the primary presidential candidate, I think will enable the Democrats to really dial up that language in a way that will really benefit them. And I think she'll be a bit more able to be nimble and respond when the Republicans try to obfuscate and say, well, it's essentially out of our hands now, which is blatantly ridiculous. Broadly on issues, I would say, obviously, a big one for the Republicans is they're going to try and really tar her with the brush of being the border czar, which is what they call her very early on in the Biden-Harris administration. She was kind of given oversight of this portfolio of basically dealing with the border issues, particularly obviously down south. It's a complicated one, right? Obviously America has a land border, but Australians would be very familiar with how potent and toxic debates about who is allowed into the country and under what circumstances can become. And for all intents and purposes, as much as there was a lot of work done by the Democrats around how they ended family separations, they did a lot of stuff that was quite inhumane that was occurring in how the border was being managed. There's still a really big, I think, combined with the economic pressures that we have at the moment, there's a really big issue that hasn't been resolved there, and the Republicans will be looking to tag her with that, to tying, crime rates or other, employment, all of these issues they will try and tie to, illegal immigration, and then tie that to Kamala. And the sort of, if you believe the insidery talk that, my far more esteemed colleagues in US publications get leaks about, there seems to have been a problem quite the way through this Biden term where Harris wasn't really able to settle into a portfolio, couldn't really take ownership of a particular issue. And if she's not able to define that space of, what was her baby, what was her achievement during these past 4 years, and the Republicans will rush very quickly to tag her with, failure around the border.
Yeah, I'll be interested in how that kind of clashes with her previous role as a prosecutor, because I think that probably, as you said, that's what the Trump ticket will be seeking to define her as, and really use that the politics of illegal immigration to tar her with that brush and failures down there. But I do think, she's got a strong record, sometimes that upsets liberals in America, in terms of her role as a prosecutor and being able to prosecute kind of, or makes her less weak, I guess, on law and order issues, generally speaking. And again, coming back to that idea of a bit of a clean slate, I think because she is the VP and not the president, she can kind of, perhaps walk that line between claiming some of the best things and kind of making a bit of a break with the Biden administration on new things that she would pursue in her term as president, as potentially a circuit breaker. I did also, I guess, want to come to, if we're talking about issues, I'm not sure how much you're across the concerns around Project 2025, which, again, I feel like the Trump campaign has tried to distance itself from, but is very clearly kind of interconnected, at least with campaign stuff. And I guess I'm interested in not only what it means for America, but for countries like Australia who see themselves allied with the United States. There's some pretty frightening stuff in there, some pretty illiberal kind of anti-democratic stuff that I think a lot of Australians would find very concerning. Do you have any thoughts on some of those kind of extreme plans, I guess, that we've seen if Trump is to win the presidency again.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about broadly this 2025 plan is a lot of it is sort of just trying to codify what kind of organically started to happen over the course of the Trump term, in that he didn't set out to be undermining every single institution in America, that he ultimately did end up undermining it. It's snowballed. And I don't mean obviously the big things like calling into question and the Department of Justice and all of those sorts of things. But even on, if you think about some of the silly stuff, like when there was a hurricane or something that was due to hit sort of around Texas, and Trump had gone wildly out and said it was going to go much further inland than whatever their equivalent of the Bureau of Meteorology had said. He just got a Sharpie and drew on the map and said, "Oh no, here you go. Like, here's the official map. This is like that. This really happened, right?" He couldn't even abide by the advice of essentially the Weather Bureau. And so there was a lot of what organically began there in terms of just really trying to undermine or warp those fundamental institutions, which are essentially, as much as obviously the executive government plays a role here, but they're essentially what keeps a democracy in check, right? You can have governments that come in and pass legislation that push a country one way or the other, but at some point, there are a lot of bureaucrats, there are a lot of people in the legal system, there are a lot of people across government agencies that, like, they aren't as dynamic as a government. They're not going to be able to just switch on a dime, and they've got this institutionalized structure that makes countries like America, like Australia, weather those tests to democratic processes a lot better. What's different about 2025 is it's not just chipping away at something ad hoc because this particular department or this court decision or this ruling goes against what Trump wants. This is coming in and saying we are going to fundamentally restructure and change or abolish or put people in charge of these key institutions that would essentially allow us to continue our agenda. And in doing that, you are breaking down potentially, in my view, the things that have somewhat safeguarded a lot of those democratic principles in a way that's quite deliberate and targeted rather than accidental and accumulative, or at least neglectful, maybe not accidental. So for me, the big issue with 2025 is less about how many ex-Trump staffers are involved or how close he is to it, but it's this shift in the thinking and a recognition that part of why Trump couldn't get where he wanted to get, including returning to the White House after January 6th, was because the institutions wouldn't let him. And so this shift, I think, and this is going to translate quite directly, if you want to put it in the Australian context, is if you have politicians coming through and they're undermining these core institutions or the way that we essentially set up our government to run, then that, I think, is something we should be concerned about. And any discussion that talks about really overhauling the roles of these different, very deliberately separate bodies, that's where I think globally there's real risk to, the ongoing democracy project, that, the work is never done. We're constantly refining it. It's not a perfect system, but it's the best one we have. So the concern for me is that real shift toward deliberately trying to demolish the things that a lot of those supporters of the sort of MAGA movement feel got in the way of what their, omnipotent president was trying or seeking to do, which is terrifying.
It is, yeah. And I think sometimes in Australia we take for granted, our independent Australian Electoral Commission and the fact that we do, problematic though it's been in recent years with things like robo-debt, our independent public service giving frank and fearless advice to the government of the day. As you said, those are all checks and balances on the power of the executive, at least, or should be. So yeah, it is really concerning. I want to shift now a little bit. I'm sure we'll come back to in the questions, and just a reminder, you can pop questions for Clare or I into the Q&A there. To domestic federal politics. And we've seen in recent weeks some pretty concerning revelations about criminal infiltration of the CFMEU. For people who haven't been following that closely, could you just talk to us a little bit about what those allegations are and how the federal government has responded so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about the CFMEU, we're which is obviously a very broad union. We're sort of specifically really looking at the construction, obviously the C part and CFMEU wing, which I think the average Australian would have a passing knowledge, is quite famously very bolshy about pursuing rights and conditions, pay for their workers. And what we've seen through a series of very excellent reporting from my colleagues at Nine and the AFI, SMH, is that these union roles, often that are quite highly paid, were being ending up being given to people with known connections to organised crime, to motorcycle gangs, and obviously it's as I said, it's allegations, but really showing how these kinds of really unsavoury characters were being brought into the union movement, making a lot of money working on big state and federal publicly funded construction works, and undertaking behaviour and activity that most people would say doesn't pass the pub test of what you would expect a union representative to be doing. So that's sort of the gist of it. Obviously, the complicating factor here is that the union movement generally, obviously very tied to and associated with Labor, but the CFMEU specifically, the sort of the left within the left faction, but specifically from the trades movement rather than more social public service type unions, has been a huge donor and a huge supporter and has huge power in many of the key decisions that land candidates in certain seats and all of that kind of thing. So as much as it's a crisis around this specific division of the union and potential links to criminal behaviour, it's also about how that flows and affects the current, Labor governments all around the country.
Mm. Yeah, we have seen in the Nine papers, I think, some direct links via, as you mentioned, publicly funded construction projects that have caused some issues at the state level for various premiers. And I think that's led to talk, particularly from the coalition, obviously, about restoring the ABCC, the Australian Building and Construction Commission, I think it was, that was abolished by this government. And I was, watching Zoe Daniel on Insiders kind of talk about, well, perhaps there is role for some kind of regulator, but whether or not it has to be that, because, I mean, frankly, I don't think it certainly didn't improve productivity in the construction sector, which it was supposed to do. But also, I don't think it was very successful about uncovering, issues like this itself as a regulator. Do you think that's where this will now move to, about what is the best way to kind of uncover these kinds of criminal links that maybe don't look like the ABC, but perhaps in some other form?
Yeah, I think it's this is a bit of a personal opinion, but it's felt obvious to me for a while, watching successive coalition efforts to reinstate the ABCC and then Labor ones to block and get rid of it, that as with all things, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And it's pretty obvious that this particular wing and type of union does need some kind of extra oversight, in a way that, you're not seeing representatives from the nursing or the teachers union rocking up to someone's house late at night making threats and handing over cash under the table. And it's very obvious that there actually is a specific need in this sector for some kind of oversight. And the problem with the ABCC, it depends on who you ask. Labor are saying now, well, there's no point returning to it because it didn't catch a lot of this activity. It wasn't effective when it was running. And the coalition, not incorrectly, points out that, well, a lot of the reporting talks about an escalation in the last couple of years when the ABC and when Labor in government, the ABCC was on the way out. And also when you talk to people in the construction sector, they don't feel that the ABCC ever operated in its sort of way intended, because it in and of itself was caught up in the rules and the compliance, and I think one of the complaints from, if you take the industry side of the debate, is that the CFMEU representatives are often incredibly well equipped to understand and implement their rights in ways that are totally legitimate, but create just enough inconvenience that it does have a serious impact on productivity, but that also then has a cooling effect on someone trying to go to the ABCC, and it can be really mundane things like waiting until cement is just about ready to pour and then stopping work, and quite legitimately stopping work, but obviously doing it at that exact moment is a lot more of a dent to productivity than it would have been either side of a time sensitive activity like that. And so, from the industry's point of view, I think they don't even think the ABCC was working as intended. So going forward, if we're agreeing there needs to be oversight here, and I think when you get into the detail of the allegations in this latest reporting and the fact that Labor has moved so quickly to allow other parts of the union to break away, to put them into administration, to then now be reviewing what happens next. There's talk of deregistering once again. So I think they are now, all sides are acknowledging there needs to be something. Maybe it wasn't the ABCC. In the sort of cut and thrust of binary politics, the coalition will say, well, no, we should just go back to it, or something even stronger. But the likely outcome to me seems to be that there will have to be some kind of new body that has enough distance from either side, from government and from industry, to be able to, and some teeth to really be able to do what it needs to do.
Yeah. The other thing that this has really, I think, brought up for me is the fact that time and again, it feels like Australian regulators are just not doing their job either. Kind of lack the will or the appetite to really prosecute their role in an effective way, or they lack the resources. We've seen funding cut over recent years to a number of regulatory bodies, but kind of ASIC's not doing that great of a job. The ACCC has kind of asked for additional powers that it hasn't been granted. And it's really the media that has been exposing a lot of these kind of systemic issues of either corruption or kind of malpractice, I guess, within huge industries that are really causing problems for Australian citizens and consumers. It seems to me there's kind of a bigger problem with our regulatory system, that they, either don't feel empowered or don't feel they've got the resources to go after these kinds of things. And talking about a new regulator for building and construction, I mean, that's serious and systemic corruption involving public contracts, as we've heard. Surely this is something that the National Anti-Corruption Commission could be looking into, or would certainly have the powers to do so. But we've just recently seen it decline to even look into things like, the rorts when it came to, some of those grants that came with ministerial approval, and the checking, the spreadsheets that the coalition government has that we've kind of colour-coded to marginal seats. I mean, do you think there is a wider problem here that with Australian regulators, when the media is kind of doing this role that regulators should be doing?
It's probably an unpopular opinion, but in a way, yes, journalism is maybe doing what regulators should be doing, but I'm a firm believer in the fourth estate, and I actually think that that's the media serving its purpose. And would it be great if the media in general have a bit more flexibility and capacity to be sort of eyes, ears everywhere? They're not as guided by the processes of regulators. I think maybe where the piece is a bit missing is exactly as you mentioned, that if something does come to light, where that regulator is able to then step in and step up and take over and actually deliver some of the policy or setting changes that are required. And I mean, if you go back to the CFMEU as an example, me saying that they cause a lot of problems for industry is not to say that they don't also do a great job. I mean, we wouldn't have the situation with the man-made bench tops. I can never remember exactly what that's called. That was obviously the stone that was killing people. They have achieved a lot for the safety standards of workers. You're talking about very like physical hard labor jobs that do come with a lot of safety risks, and we have some of the best conditions in terms of safety standards in the world because we have had that strong union movement. But I think where the regulators maybe fall short is they don't have the resources to go, okay, well, that's great that you're here advocating for these conditions, and it is absolutely right that you do that. But the point at which you are essentially being a nuisance as a standover tactic to ensure that your public funds over others, well, that's an overreach, and that's a problem. And where I think the issue with the NAC, that body is in terms of referring. I mean, for all we know, people have referred a lot of this CFMEU stuff to the NAC. They obviously don't report when they receive referrals, and any member of the public can do it. The threshold for corruption is quite specific and quite high, and that can be frustrating, but it obviously exists for a reason, because once you get into those defined terms, you're starting to talk about very serious penalties, potentially. And so I think what we will see in these first few years of the NAC is the public having to somewhat readjust its expectations of what really is going to be within the scope of this body. And that's not to say that dodgy grants or other things aren't worthy of inquiry and investigation and reform, but that may not reach the threshold of this body, which is supposed to be looking at real systemic corruption issues. And we do have a good parliamentary system of inquiries. We have royal commissions. We have other sort of levers that can be pulled when these issues do get brought to the fore. But I guess to circle back on, what's going wrong broadly with regulators in Australia, you'd have to say, I'm sure any single one of them would say, I wish we had way more resources, or that those resources were properly deployed. We see that with the NDIS, the regulators in that system. It's increasingly better resourced, but it's sort of been this ad hoc pulled together system. And so the deployment and the focus of those resources is not necessarily where it kind of needs to be. So it's a bit hit and miss in that regard.
And yeah, I mean, certainly I would never want the media, like regulators play an important role, but as you said, like absolutely critical for the media to be able to operate here. And I think this really just demonstrates what a critical function of democracy strong public interest investigative journalism really, really plays, and to the benefit of all Australians, really. We'll go to questions from the audience in just a second. So just a reminder that you can type those questions into the Q&A box here. And if you want to upvote questions that you really want answered, that will help me find the good questions to ask Claire. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, today. I can see we've got about 330 people on the line with us. Thank you so much. The first question is from Pam, who asks, is democracy under threat with a Trump presidency, particularly with that Project 2025 manifesto?
Yeah, I mean, I think a back-to-back Trump presidency would have been quite scary, in that sense that you've got that accumulative effect of eroding those institutions that I was talking about. A Trump presidency, which, still, according to the polls, is our most likely outcome by the end of this year. Yes, I don't think you could. You would be wrong to say that it's not. The commentary around everything since January 6th has just sort of compounded what was already quite a fragile political peace, I guess, in America, and it obviously has become increasingly febrile. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump speaks to that polarization. Whether, do I think democracy can survive another Donald Trump term? Yes. But, will it be damaged on the way through? I think that has to be the case. And you see a lot of sort of preparing for that in the behavior of other countries. We just saw at the meeting of NATO nations last month, they essentially Trump-proofed a lot of their support for Ukraine because Trump, and now particularly with his VP candidate, are quite isolationist and aren't necessarily interested in funding that war against Russia in the way that the Biden administration has been supporting. So I think there's a bit of a realist streak across the world in a lot of established democracies, Western democracies, that are saying, yeah, if this happens, this is going to be a test. But I think that people are somewhat prepared for it and are prepared to recover from it in 4 years.
Mm. There's a couple of other questions here, all related to the US. So we might just take those, as a chunk and stick on topic there. The next one is from Terence, who asks about Kamala Harris and the divisions over the Biden administration's response to Israel's war on Gaza. And the question is, will Kamala Harris stand up for Palestinians, or I guess perhaps delineate herself from the approach that President Biden has taken? And if I can put something on top of that, Claire, I think we saw in the primaries, for example, that the administration's response to the war in Gaza and what a lot of people perceived as a lack of a response when it comes to standing up for Palestinian civilians really did become quite an issue for the Democrats in terms of turnout. And in some specific states, we saw it impact on, I think it was voters perhaps in Michigan, rather than endorsing Biden, voting uncommitted in the primaries. We haven't seen, obviously it's very early for Kamala Harris, but do you think there's a possibility there that she will take a bit of a different approach on that issue?
It's a complicated one. I mean, obviously she's part of the administration that's had this approach, and while you sort of flagged earlier, there is obviously a bit more capacity and scope for her to massage that narrative a little bit and pivot on this particular issue. Like, it is a big one to tackle when you're stepping into the presidential boxing ring in the next, with 3 months to go, and you're trying to map out an entire policy platform. She personally hasn't necessarily indicated a position that is, divergent or differing from the president's, but obviously it would have been incredibly shocking of her to have done that, given she was his VP. So I think I wouldn't want to presume to say that she for sure isn't going to change her approach and position, because she, it just wasn't, she basically would have to step back if she was going to start attacking Biden over that issue from where she was as vice president. Obviously, it is an issue that is motivating voters. It's becoming a big factor in a lot of sort of centre-left moderate governments. You see that in Australia here with Anthony Albanese, particularly members. The Labor membership in Australia is on average more left than the actual caucus in Parliament. You see that very similarly with Democrats. They're a broad church. Biden in particular was, I guess for Australia we would almost say centre right, but centre. And Kamala, she's from California, but she brings in, as you said, this legal background. She's quite centre as well. The membership skews more to the left, and broadly, even across political divide, there's genuine concern about the position that Palestinian civilians are being put in. So I guess that this is a complicated way of me saying I don't really know, but only because it's such a complicated issue, it'll be something that we're looking at very closely, knowing how tight it is to turn out. But obviously the US has a storied history of being very supportive of Israel's right to exist and continuing to do that. I don't foresee her suddenly saying, for example, that they won't be supplying the kinds of aid and even military aid that they have been. Whether she shifts elsewhere in terms of trying to get toward a peace process or some kind of further recognition of Palestine is maybe where there's more scope to move. But I wouldn't be expecting her to change militarily where the US position is now.
Another question in here about Kamala being nominated for the presidency and what impact this will have on our own leadership here in Australia in terms of gender equality and the female vote. And if I can just add to that, she's also a woman of colour, and we obviously saw Hillary Clinton cop quite a bit of sexism and misogyny when she ran for Parliament. Barack Obama obviously experienced a huge amount of racism and the whole birther conspiracy that Donald Trump started. I wonder if you could talk about those elements as well. Maybe that's more for the US than it is for here. But yeah, how do you see that playing out if we have another female candidate for president?
Oh, yeah, I mean, honestly, it'll give us another data point to try and quantify exactly what being a woman does to your primary vote, because it's a bit of an unknown. I think you would have to assume that there's going to be a degree of misogyny, of sexism and racism that will play into people's perceptions and the vote that Kamala Harris ultimately, if she becomes the candidate formally, ultimately receives. That was tested by Hillary, convoluted by a whole bunch of other political factors, her own personal popularity, a whole bunch of other, the legacy of the Clintons. Hard to discern exactly how much of, the result for her was to do with that, but I think it's undeniable that a part of it was. And same with Obama, a part of it was. So it absolutely is going to impact her. I don't think we know how much because we've never tested it before. And so what that means, I mean, it's obviously huge to have only the second female presidential candidate in the history of the United States in its current form. We as Australians, we've had one person who didn't even actually contest an election. Contested an election in a way that was so kind of skewed by the way she'd become, the way Gillard took the leadership skewed so much of that result. I don't think you could hand on heart say how much misogyny and sexism potentially played into popular support for her because of that particular political sort of time. What it means, I think, is it's so silly to say, but you can't be what you can't see. And I think it's really important that, it's as horrible as it is, that some of these women are sort of like the first ones over the trenches. We need to keep sending women over the trenches, because then eventually we, through sheer force of will, we're going to see progress. And I think that's what we have seen. And you see that this in other levels of the government in the US. There's many female governors and people in these positions. So it's the next step. It'll be an interesting data point, particularly for a test case that we really haven't seen before. How that translates to Australia, I think, is it's much the same. We restart the conversation of, why are there no women once again in contention for leadership positions like that in Australia? So I'm hopeful, as much as I'm also cynical about the reality of probably what will happen, because it is still very early days.
The next question that I've got here is from Ron, who talks about misinformation in elections, and he's mentioned Clive Palmer there, but I'm thinking today, I guess, of the reports of the LNP in Queensland using an AI-generated image of the Queensland Premier, Stephen Miles. Ron's question is around the impact of AI in the next federal election, and I guess that issue of misinformation that keeps cropping up in elections all around the world. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know the government's looking potentially at some electoral reforms and AI, but that seems to be, the legislation around AI is kind of quite specifically, I think, around deepfake porn, for example, not kind of the implications for a federal election.
Yeah, look, well, I mean, I think the thing about AI and in the electoral context that is so terrifying is at its infancy, at the time that someone's creating it, it's not misinformation, it's disinformation. It's someone has deliberately created a false image, false video to mislead and misrepresent. It can then quickly become misinformation, because by the time it's passed through one hand, the receiver from that moment onwards is not necessarily going to be maliciously passing something on knowing that it's incorrect. So it quickly becomes misinformation. But it seems to me that the risk of just unfettered creation of disinformation, because it is so easy and it's so economical, anyone can do it. Anyone can do it. That I don't think that the country is prepared. I don't think that in any way are we actually going to really know how to deal with this, kind of until it's too late. And I think the best we can do is try to get some collaboration with the tech platforms that are obviously going to be hosting a lot of this content, that surely they themselves have the technological capability to be able to try and detect and inform people and potentially immediately take down material that is directly related to the election that is false and created by AI. The government is deeply interested in this. All political parties are, as much as we've seen, the LNP, as you say, in Queensland, do that with Premier Miles. At the end of the day, if you told any of these political parties about just no AI, they'd all say yes, because none of them actually want it to be turned on them. So I don't know that there's the technological understanding or the relationships, or I don't think the tech companies themselves have fully grappled with it. I'd like to see Meta AI and ChatGPT and all of these other platforms put in their own redundancies and safeguards and checks so that, people can't create an image of Anthony Albanese looking like XYZ thing that you want to misrepresent him as. So I think it will have it won't have I don't think we're at a point where it's going to be like an election deciding level of impact. But as much as we've seen social media discourse impact voting, and that's how we sometimes, how we had that period sort of in the mid-2010s when polling was way off because people were not getting their information, they're not engaging through traditional means. I think this continues that skewing of how people get their information and what they understand out of it. And it's a real opportunity to probably try and get in on the ground floor and address it. I don't have a lot of faith that that's going to happen this time around.
Yeah, and it was certainly an issue that kind of came up a lot during the Voice campaign, in particular, the misinformation and disinformation and accusations from both sides there. And just taking us back to, some of those threats to democratic institutions and the role of an independent AEC. I mean, I think the AEC has been quite clear that it doesn't want to necessarily play that role of arbitrating that, but it's very clear it is something that's going to need to be regulated. The Australia Institute has done a lot of research into implementing truth in political advertising laws, which are in operation currently in the ACT and South Australia, that a lot of political parties have shown an interest in, at least, and are potentially on the table as part of incoming electoral reforms. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, Claire, you're really right about the role actually of a lot of these social media organizations and tech platforms who, are going to be absolutely critical if we've got any hope of kind of arresting the onslaught of this kind of thing. You're not going to be able to do it without them, I guess. So that's something for people to keep in mind for sure.
Sorry, I'm just gonna join the meeting from my phone because I can see my computer's about to die. So
okay, no worries.
Sorry, I was listening then, but I just realized my computer's about to die. So
no worries.
Technology in St Helens, Tasmania.
Yeah, well, Claire, actually, if you like, there's 10 minutes to go, but we can probably wrap it up there if your laptop is about to die. I know that we've got a couple of other questions there. I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions as per usual. But thank you so much for joining us today, Claire. We really appreciate it, from regional Tasmania.
I can log back on if that doesn't ruin the recording, but otherwise, yes. was one of those days.
Yeah, no, we appreciate you jumping in the car so you could get reception. And thanks to everyone who's joined us today. We really appreciate you coming along as well. As I said, we'll put up the recording of this just a little bit later. And don't forget to thank Claire for joining us. We really appreciate it, Claire, and hopefully we'll get you back on before too long. Enjoy regional Tasmania. And if you are in Tasmania or anywhere else across the country, the Australia Institute is hosting Nobel Prize winning economist Professor Joseph Stiglitz at the end of this month. He's visiting a number of cities around Australia, including Hobart. So head on over to our website to check out what some of those events are and secure tickets. They are selling fast. Sydney is already sold out, where he'll be in conversation with Malcolm Turnbull. And Dr. Emma Shortis, who's been, I think some of you might have seen her on the news with regards to the United States election. And thank you again to all of you for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.